In the hospital ward, a man took out an exquisite box and pulled out an extremely luxurious coffee machine from it because a billionaire was going to stay in this room. But when the man opened the curtain, he found a poor man lying here.
What are you doing here?
Oh, fighting for my life.
Shortly afterwards, the billionaire himself moved into the hospital ward. This hospital belonged to him, but he still couldn't stay in a single room because he had previously canceled the single rooms to accommodate more people and make more money for himself. Both men in the ward had cancer, but their lives were completely opposite. The billionaire's name was Edward and the poor man's name was Carter. Edward had endless money, but when he got cancer, only his assistant would be by his side. Compared to Edward, Carter always had people accompanying him. Seeing Carter's family members frequently visiting, Edward became curious about Carter's family. Carter generously showed Edward photos of his 2 sons and a daughter. When Carter asked if Edward had children, Edward didn't say anything. Edward had undergone 4 marriages in his life, but none of them lasted. The only successful union he had was with his career. Starting at the age of 16, he makes money nonstop. On the other hand, Carter's life went in the opposite direction. He wanted to become a history professor, but when he finally got into college, he found out that his girlfriend was pregnant. As a penniless African American with a family to support, he could only give up his dream and became an auto mechanic. He always thought about going back to school, but in the blink of an eye, a lifetime had passed.
Like smoke through a keyhole.
The next day, the doctor came to inform Edward that his cancer cells had spread throughout his body and he was about to start the first chemotherapy session.
Love the smell of chemo in the morning.
At this moment, Edward still pretended to be tough and made a laugh. When the doctor was about to leave, Carter called him over. He knew very little about his own condition and wanted the doctor to take a look. The doctor just simply said he wasn't his patient, then walked out. That night, Edward prepared a big meal and wanted Carter to have a taste as well. But Carter politely declined, knowing that it would be pointless to eat.
Best in L.A.
Ain't the best in LA no more.
That night, the doctor came to the ward and told Edward some bad news. According to test results, Edward could live for at most 1 more year. Knowing how much time one has left is actually a terrifying thing because from that moment on, everything is marked with a deadline. Edward pretended to remain calm. Carter saw everything and tried to say something to comfort Edward. Before the doctor left, Edward stopped him and asked Carter if there was anything he wanted to ask. And Carter only wanted to know the results of his examination. Edward took off his glasses sadly. His brilliant life was about to come to an end. Carter tried to say something to comfort him, but now any words of comfort seemed useless. It was only when the doctor came in and told Carter the test results that he, like Edward, only had 1 more year to live. Carter ripped up the bucket list he had been writing and realized that with only 1 year left, he wouldn't be able to do anything. Now it was Edward's turn to look at him. They had become sympathetic old friends facing the same illness.
You want to play cards? Thought you'd never ask.
Early the next morning, Edward's assistant came to the ward and picked up the discarded paper ball. Edward curiously asked him to bring it over and began to study the list. Carter immediately asked him to hand it back.
Give it back. It was on the floor. I didn't know it was a state secret.
Carter explained that it was a bucket list. Edward was very interested in it. Out of goodwill to help a stranger, laughed until tears streamed down his face. Edward thought these wishes were too ridiculous, but he continued to add his own wishes to the list. What confused him was,
What the hell is witness something majestic?
You ever been to the Himalayas?
Edward was determined to complete these wishes. But when it came time to execute them, Carter hesitated. Edward told him not to worry about money as he only had money left. But it wasn't about money. Carter started making excuses.
Just trying to get a handle on blah, blah, blah. Metaphors. You're the one crying you never took a shot. Here's your chance.
My chance to what? Make a fool of myself?
Never too late.
Under Edward's continuous persuasion, Carter finally decided to complete the wishes on the list. At this moment, Carter's wife arrived. Edward tactfully left the ward and Carter told his wife about the test results. She refused to admit that it was true and wanted to find a new hospital for him. Carter snatched the phone and took the opportunity to say that he would be leaving for a while. His wife couldn't understand why he would leave his family at the end of his life, and they had a fight.
How you can just quit fighting?
Virginia.
Why don't you tell our children that? See what they say when they find out you've given up on them.
His wife angrily left the ward, and so the two of them began their final journey. The first thing they did was skydiving. Carter, who was afraid of flying, accomplished a feat. Edward, who seeks excitement, followed closely behind. Then Edward took Carter in his dream Ford Mustang. The two of them experienced some wild racing on the track. Afterward, they hopped onto Edward's private plane without stopping. Heading to France, Edward took him to the restaurant he had been patronizing for 30 years. This was the first time he had brought a man with him. Edward couldn't help himself and began to tell stories. The most unforgettable one was Emily's 10th birthday. It was then that Carter learned that Edward had a daughter. But unfortunately, they haven't been in contact for a long time. Carter wanted to add to reconnect with Edward's daughter to the list, but Edward snatched the pen and crossed out that. Carter suddenly got up and left the table. Edward thought Carter was angry. He followed him into the bathroom and tried to apologize. But to his surprise, he found fresh blood seeping from Carter's chest. It turned out that the catheter on Carter's chest had come loose. Fortunately, it wasn't a big problem. The two of them returned to Edward's home in France. Carter wanted to take a refreshing bath. But then Edward received a call from Carter's wife, asking him to bring Carter back. Edward was a bit hesitant, because it wasn't up to him to decide. Edward went to the bathroom and struggled to persuade Carter to go back. But Carter could tell at first glance that his wife had called. In fact, Carter was willing to be with him, not because Edward brainwashed him, but because he had made a thoughtful decision himself. When Carter left, he believed there was a problem with his relationship with his wife. Ever since their kids went to college, it was just the two of them at home. That feeling of not being able to cross the road without holding her hand had disappeared.
She was the same woman I fell in love with. She hadn't changed. But somehow everything was different.
Edward understood that he wouldn't end this journey until he figured out the reason. And so the two of them continued to fulfill the wishes on their list. This time, they came to the African savanna. Here, animals roamed in groups, galloping on the golden grasslands. Edward crossed off the wish to hunt a lion here. But since they were already here, some shots still had to be fired.
One proved to be enough.
Then the two of them arrived at the top of the pyramids. Edward thought he could cross off two wishes at once, but Carter insisted on seeing the miracle of the Himalayas before considering it a miracle.